What if NWBO becomes one of the biggest biotech winners? But what if the same story that could send this stock higher could also crush it? That's the question investors need to ask right now. NWBO is a highly speculative biotech stock, and its future is closely connected to DCVax-L and the regulatory process. So today, we're breaking down the top 5 risks that could crush NWBO stock. And trust me, you don't want to miss number 1. Risk number 5, extreme volatility. NWBO is not a stable blue-chip company. It's a small biotech stock, which means investor sentiment can move the price very quickly. When investors become excited about DCVax-L, the stock can move aggressively higher. But if investors become nervous about regulatory delays, financing, or commercialization, the stock can move sharply lower. And here's something important. A stock trading around the 17-cent area isn't automatically cheap just because the number looks small. It can still lose a huge percentage of its value. So let me ask you, would you rather own a high-risk stock with potentially huge upside or a safer company with slower growth? Tell me in the comments. Risk number 4, dilution and financing. This is one of the biggest risks I would personally watch. Biotech development requires money, clinical work, manufacturing, regulatory processes, employees, and commercialization all cost money. If NWBO needs additional capital, issuing more shares could be one way to raise funds, but that creates dilution. In simple terms, the company could become more valuable while your percentage ownership becomes smaller. So investors shouldn't only ask, can DCVax-L succeed? They should also ask, how will NWBO finance the next stage? Because a great product story can still become a difficult investment if shareholders face heavy dilution. Risk number 3, regulatory uncertainty. Now we get to one of the biggest catalysts. DCVax-L is at the center of the NWBO investment story. The company has submitted its marketing authorization application to the UK's MHRA, and according to the company's latest update, the application remains under regulatory review. That sounds positive, but remember this, under review does not mean approved. Regulators can ask additional questions, request information, delay decisions, or ultimately reject an application. So I would be very careful with anyone saying approval is guaranteed. It isn't. At the same time, investors shouldn't automatically assume rejection either. That uncertainty is exactly what makes NWBO so interesting and so risky. But we're not finished, because the next 2 risks are even more important. And number 1 could determine whether NWBO eventually becomes a major biotech success or a painful lesson for investors. But now we're getting to the 2 risks that I think investors should pay the closest attention to. And number 1 is the big one. Risk number 2, approval doesn't automatically mean huge revenue. Let's imagine NWBO receives positive regulatory news. Does that instantly mean billions in revenue? No. The company would still need to manufacture DCVax-L efficiently. Hospitals and doctors would need to adopt it. Patients would need access. Insurance and reimbursement would matter. And NWBO would need enough capital to commercialize the treatment. So regulatory approval could be a massive milestone. But commercialization is a completely different challenge. And this is where investors could get surprised. The market may eventually ask, okay, you got approval. Now show us the revenue. That's the part I think investors need to remember. Risk number 1. The investment thesis depends heavily on a few major catalysts. This is the risk I personally think matters most. NWBO doesn't have dozens of massive businesses supporting its valuation. The future of the company is heavily connected to DCVax-L and its ability to move toward commercialization. That creates massive upside, but also massive downside. If the regulatory path goes well, commercialization becomes realistic, and financing is managed properly, the market could value NWBO very differently. But if the regulatory process suffers a major setback, delays become excessive, or commercialization disappoints, the stock could fall dramatically. Now let's talk about price. My personal opinion is that if the bullish story continues developing, 0.30 to 0.50 could become an interesting zone. If NWBO gets a major positive regulatory development and investors start pricing in a real commercial opportunity, $1 becomes a much more interesting psychological target. But I would not tell you that $5 or $10 is guaranteed. That would be speculation, not responsible analysis. On the bearish side, if NWBO faces a serious regulatory setback or significant financing pressure, I wouldn't be surprised to see the stock revisit 0.10 or potentially lower. So what do I think? I see NWBO as a very high-risk, high-reward biotech speculation. And here's the twist. Most investors are asking, Can NWBO reach $1? But I think the better question is, what has to happen before NWBO deserves $1? That's what I'll be watching. Now I want your opinion. If DCVax-L receives a positive regulatory outcome, do you think NWBO can reach $1? Or do you think the risks are simply too high? Drop your target in the comments. 0.50, 1.5 or something else? And if you enjoyed this analysis, hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Because the next major NWBO catalyst could completely change the story. This is my personal analysis, not financial advice. Always do your own research before investing.